are talking Satan's Slaves 2, Communion. At least that is the English translation of this Indonesian movie. Once again directed and written by Joko Anwar, who was responsible for the first movie. Now, the first movie came out in 2017, and this is one sequel where I say you really do need to watch the original before watching this one. It's not a movie I would say you can particularly jump into and completely understand. And even having watched the first movie, there are still a few elements here that I was a little fuzzy on. But let's discuss, what is this movie about? Obviously a follow-on from the original 2017 movie with the same cast playing the kind of the same characters. And it's set around 3 years after the events of the original movie. Now, I'm going to have to somewhat spoil that original movie for you if you've not seen it, but there is a non-spoiler review of that film on the channel. But ultimately, our family have got away from their youngest brother, who seems to have been the offspring of Satan, and are now living in a kind of somewhat desolate high-rise kind of skyscraper building, which is somewhat of a retcon from the end of the first movie, which they do address, but the setup is slightly different. And this is a high-rise that was built kind of cheaply. It's below kind of sea level, and it is easily kind of flooded and things like this. And there's kind of a big storm coming. Everyone there seems to be living in somewhat poverty. This family, who of course we've got our older sister, the two younger brothers. The youngest brother is obviously, if you've seen the first movie, is somewhere else, and the father. And they're all living in like in a one-bedroom apartment in this kind of high-rise, and you know, struggling to make ends meet. And we have this accident that happens in the movie, which ends up killing some people. And then the residents of this building are victims of this kind of storm, which kind of floods the area, and then no one can kind of get to them. And that's, of course, when the supernatural stuff starts to happening, following on from the events of the original movie, with kind of spirits, satanic cults, and even zombies kind of making an appearance. What'll happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what I think works in this movie. So Joko Anwar, I gotta say, has a kind of somewhat of a unique style, and I do feel, as I've watched his films, this is the kind of the third film I think I've watched of his. You can see the kind of the confidence growing behind the camera, but this film feels very assured. I mean, one of the things that struck me most about this movie is the strong directorial style here. I mean, this movie looks great. I mean, it's the use of this high-rise tower compared to, for example, the out-of-the-way rural kind of farmhouse in the kind of the original movie. It's obviously a very different setting, but he makes it seem so oppressive and quite frankly quite scary. This building, I mean, obviously they've kind of found some, you know, great locations and stuff like this, but it kind of looks so oppressive. It almost looks like a prison. And there's some really kind of, honestly, fantastic cinematography here that really does sell you on the fact that there's something going on with this kind of building. You know, is it a building which has had a somewhat of a kind of sketchy past, maybe used for unnatural kind of purposes? Obviously you have to watch the kind of the movie here, but it looks great. It kind of gives you that impression, and it kind of really kind of doubles down with something that I think worked in the first movie, was this feeling of, you know, a impoverished state where the people who are living in this kind of particular building are really kind of on the lower rungs of the class system, so to speak, and are really struggling. And it gives it this kind of this third world kind of grimy feel, where these people are struggling as it is, and then we throw all this kind of supernatural kind of shenanigans on, and it makes it so much worse for them. But it gives it this very sort of like unique feel to it. And as with the first movie, I've got to say, I think the acting was solid. Now, I sometimes find it difficult to really judge foreign language movies, this being an Indonesian movie. But you know, you can sort of get the idea of the emotional kind of resonance. What, obviously, even if you're reading the subtitles, you understand the emotional beats that are happening on screen and how the actors are portraying them. And I've got to say once again that everyone does a great job here. And it's good that they've used, obviously, the same cast, all who have aged up somewhat now. So you're seeing the kind of the same characters you know, who have grown up a little bit now. So the two kind of younger brothers are now a little bit older and, you know, a little bit more kind of responsible. One thing that's a little different in this movie is rather than focusing more or less on the oldest daughter, which was the case of the first film, this now focuses on the other two siblings as well as the daughter. So we pretty much get equal screen time for these kind of three siblings, and all of them have their own kind of like different kind of side characters and kind of stories going without it. So it feels much more of an ensemble piece. There's still some pretty good scares here. I think they're a little bit. They're not quite as in your face as the first movie, I would say. This movie dials it down a little bit with the, I would say, the supernatural kind of scares. But there is one standout scene in the movie which happens just before the kind of the halfway point, involving an elevator, which I think is definitely the kind of the highlight of the movie, and it's a very, very tense scene, I have to say. And for me, that was the kind of the highlight of the scene. But there are some decent kind of like effects work with the kind of these ghostly kind of situations. And I gotta say, I think the movie does its finale is, you know, a little bit jumbled, but I gotta say I still found it quite exhilarating, quite exciting, and points to kind of a larger kind of mythology outside of what we're kind of seeing on the screen here. What doesn't work for me, I think this movie, the pacing is not quite as strong as the first film. And it runs about 2 hours. And we have the highlight of the movie, which is just before the halfway mark, which is this situation with the elevator. And then I feel it kind of slows down a bit again after that. And there's just scenes here where I feel it could have been tightened up just a little bit, because I feel the pacing just is a little long in places, a little bit kind of drags from time to time. And where we have our supernatural stuff, I think is not quite as upfront as the first film. Again, you feel like you're kind of, there are lulls in the kind of the story here. And thus, I think the pacing is just not quite as strong as the first movie. I think visually speaking, it's stronger, but the pacing to me is not quite as good. And I have to say, kind of like the first movie, the ending is a little bit jumbled. You don't fully know what's going on, at least I didn't, but you're going to get the majority of the gist of kind of what is happening here. But this movie in particular seems to be quite keen to set up a future sequel. You know, and I kind of wish movies would more or less be somewhat more self-contained in some instances. I feel sometimes films can be too eager to kind of leave stuff for the next film, and sometimes those films never happen, which leads to an unsatisfying kind of situation. I'm not saying it's the case with this one, but for me it just kind of, it feels like it's setting up a little bit too much for the third movie. You know, so there you go. But the ending itself, the kind of the climax is exciting, if a little bit kind of jumbled. And the movie, I would say, does sometimes kind of like borrow horror kind of sequences that you've seen before. You know, it's very much the same. You've got someone at the camera, you've got a big void here, that you know something's going to happen. The lights will go off, the lights will come back on again, there'll be something there, the lights will go off again and it'll be gone. And it's always like, well, who are these ghosts appearing for if it's not for the person in the sequence? You know, is it for us at the audience? Because it doesn't really make kind of sense, things like this. But it is a strong movie, and I would say, technically speaking, it's probably stronger than the first movie, to be honest. Although I think maybe the story just kind of ran a little better in the first movie, because I think it was a little bit more well paced. But I would say still the acting is just as solid, and the characterization is still as solid. But I think the actual art of filming this is a lot better than the first movie. This movie feels like its cinematography, its editing, its lighting, its sound design has all stepped up. You know, a place from the first movie, although that certainly wasn't a bad movie. But I feel this movie's slightly superior, albeit I think the story is slightly weaker. So I will give this one a 7 out of 10. I think overall it probably just pips the first one, but they're kind of very similar to a certain degree, just a little bit of peaks and troughs in some of them. So it's a 7 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.